Okay, here we go. I think people are starting to straggle in, so we're just going to give folks, I don't know, 30 seconds or so to get situated. It's nice to have everyone here. And I think we've got folks coming from all over the US and some folks from abroad, including Joe in Europe. So a bit of an international presence we got here. Yeah, looks like people are starting to come in. Okay, I think I'm gonna get started since we are planning on covering a lot of ground today and don't have a lot of time. So welcome everyone. My name is Asher Miller. I'm the Executive Director of Postcarbon Institute, the host for today's conversation. Thank you all for joining us. We know everyone's busy. We know that there are also folks who wish that they could be with us live here today, but are in school or doing or work or doing other things. I really want to thank in particular Josephine Becker, Kevin Patel, and Leslie Davenport for joining us to discuss the next generation of climate leaders and how we can help. Before we begin the conversation though, I just want to do some very quick housekeeping. I'm afraid that we won't have time to do an official Q&A today, but we have received questions and some comments in advance from folks, which we've reviewed. And we'll be keeping our eyes out for any questions or comments that you do have. We'll see if we have a chance to get to them. So if you do have a question you'd like us to address, you can submit it by typing in the chat window. There's a Q&A window as well, but please use the chat. You just click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen and type in there. We'll be monitoring it. So we have just under 75 minutes together to cover a lot of ground, as I mentioned. So I'm just going to do some very brief introductions. I'm going to start with you, Josephine. Josephine Becker is an organizer, activist, and co-host of the YIKES Podcast, which focuses on climate justice, anti-oppression, and activism. She earned her BSc in Environmental Science and Master's in Sustainability and Behavior Change from the Center for Alternative Technology in Scotland, which is a great organization that I think too few people have heard of. She recently moved to Spain to start her PhD, which focuses on post-growth organizations, specifically grassroots collectives and post-capitalist feminist political ecology, which is fascinating. I wish we had time to get into that today. Welcome, Joe. Kevin Patel has fought as an intersectional climate justice activist from Los Angeles, California for the last 10 years. In 2019, he founded OneUpAction, an organization that supports and empowers marginalized youth by providing them with the resources they need to be change makers. Kevin also created the first of its kind Youth Climate Commission in LA County to amplify youth voices on the climate crisis. He's a National Geographic Young Explorer and serves on a number of youth and climate boards. And he's currently pursuing his undergraduate degree in political science at Loyola Marymount University. Welcome, Kevin. And finally, we've got Leslie Davenport. Leslie is a psychotherapist who specializes in interdisciplinary dialogues that advance creative and effective solutions to climate change. She's a founding member of the Institute for Health and Healing, one of the US's first and largest hospital-based integrative medicine programs. And she's the author of a number of books, including her most recent, All the Feelings Under the Sun, How to Deal with Climate Change. It's a timely, thoughtful workbook that will help young readers work through their feelings of anxiety about climate change. Okay, so now without further ado, I'd like to start with you, Kevin. Can you just share with us a little bit of your story? How did you first become concerned about the climate crisis? What motivated you to act? And what kind of work and activism you've been engaged in?
Yeah, of course. As everyone knows, I was started at a very young age. I think at the age of 11 or 12, very much looking at my community of Southern California and broader community of South Central Los Angeles. But within South LA, I noticed the food inequities and food injustice that was happening, and I really wanted to do something about it. So I banded together with my local middle school and just kind of went at it and started teaching a bunch of my peers what food inequity was and what food injustice was and how we can have access to better foods such as non-GMO, organic, and vegan options, and how we can grow our own food. But then that changed in a matter of minutes, where the next semester I was actually diagnosed with heart palpitations and irregular heartbeat due to the fact that air pollution and smog pollution ravaged my community and broader Los Angeles in general. And I think air pollution is not just in Los Angeles, but all around the world and all around the nation. And so, I started I started to notice that it wasn't just one injustice. It wasn't just one issue that was affecting my community, the place that I grew up in, the place that I loved, and the people that I loved that it was affecting, right? It was a multitude of issues that were affecting my community. And so I wanted to do something about it. And ever since then, I've been advocating on behalf of the climate and environment, as well as making sure that I'm not only advocating for the planet, but I'm advocating for the people. And what motivates me is, what I don't want to have what happened to me happen to others, right? So with me being diagnosed with heart palpitations and irregular heartbeat, I said enough is enough. No community member, no person should go through this. And so I've been doing quite a lot to make sure that no community member or no person goes through, getting these health effects. But yeah, that's what motivates me, is like making sure that no one is affected by the climate crisis, and that we get climate justice.
I think so. It sounds like it was a bit of a journey for you, right? I mean, it started with food justice issues, and then your own health issues. And was it like thinking about air quality issues? How did that lead you to climate, or was climate already sort of something on your radar anyway, just growing up in this period of time?
Yeah, I think, it was already ingrained in me. I don't rarely share this, but like my parents are both immigrants, and they, both of them have backgrounds in farming. And so they migrated from India to the United States at a very young age, given that the farming in India, there's a lot of problems, and that's also a climate disaster. And so I think at a very young age, I was already integrated with the fact that my parents are climate migrants, given that, they needed to look for new opportunities, given the farming is so bad in India currently. And so I just kind of had that instinct of like, okay, this is an issue that my community is facing. Why not act upon it? Who else will use their voice, right? If not me, then, who? That's the kind of mentality that I was in, of like, okay, if I don't start speaking out, no other person will start speaking out. So I have to really be that person to speak out and allow others to speak out in my community as well, and teach them that it's okay to speak out, right? When we talk about like my community, I talk about how it's a sacrifice zone or a marginalized community, in the sense that a lot of what happens in my community is that these extractive industries, like the fossil fuel industry and all these other industries, are extracting the resources from our community, but they're not giving back. And so when I got involved with food injustice, you can see how wealthier communities had access to better foods, but then you don't see that within my community. And then when you talk about air pollution and smog pollution, that's not a problem within wealthier communities, but it is a problem within marginalized communities, such as mine. So really, making sure that I'm connecting the dots between these injustices and these issues. And that's really much, because of my parents and what their story and how they raised me, I was able to really kind of connect those dots and lead me to the climate world and kind of continuing the work that I do now. But yeah, that might be quite a lot. I went into quite a lot, but hopefully that kind of sums it up, in the sense of like, because of my parents, it led me to kind of just already knowing what to do and how to, pursue this issue.
And no, I think it's really helpful, but not everyone sets out to like start their own organized effort. So what was that? Maybe you could just tell us briefly what motivated you to, did you not find in sort of like other organizations to work with, what led you, I guess, to start your own?
Yeah, I guess there's many organizations out there. There's over 1,000 organizations that exist today. But for so long, I've been in the fight for climate justice for over 10 years. And I think for so long, a lot of the organizations that I was joining were just not suited for me. A lot of them were quite dominated by white and white passing voices, and a lot of them didn't have people who look like me within those spaces. And that continues to be true for a lot of people who I speak to in the environmental world. Um, and so I think having a space that was created for people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, right, and people who look like me, and just being able to get that support system and that network of support was something that was very much needed, given that when I was very young, I didn't have that support system. So I just wanted to have that for other generations, as well as just my generation, the people who are advocating right now, to really kind of have that network, have that support system, and saying like your advocacy, your actions will be supported no matter what, even if these organizations are not supporting. And I will add that a lot of the top environmental led organizations don't focus on grassroots efforts. They focus on quite a lot of the campaign and advocacy. So it just didn't fit into what I was focusing on at the time.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful. Joe, I want to turn it to you. And I guess ask you the same question, sort of what's your origin story with the climate crisis? Was there a moment that that happened for you, and maybe talk a little bit about what led you to do activist work or organizing work?
Yeah, firstly, thank you so much for having me. I'm super happy to be calling in from actually very far away from beautiful Galicia, the land that I'm on. And thank you, Kevin, for sharing all of that with us. So I grew mostly up in Germany, and I think similarly there wasn't for me like a turning point. Like I think like I don't remember a time where I wasn't concerned about the climate crisis. And like there wasn't like a big turning point, but there were lots of changes in the pathway. And I think because like for me there wasn't a turning point because I grew up probably on land which is very industrial. Like there's a lot of industry where I grew up. There's one of the biggest coal mines in the world. And as a child, like remembering just driving past, or like we actually went with school there, and they would tell us these stories of actually how incredible all of this is, whilst having like as a child, you actually like very much understand like this is terrible, like it looks horrible. And also like there was a lot of conflict between the police and activists that were defending an ancient forest, and seeing very much close to home how the state criminalizes people who protect the land and go against extractivist industries was like it was just so close to home that I think it shaped my understanding from like a very young age. And at the same time, I was always fed these narratives, which are very dominant in Europe, in Western white, affluent communities, that like this, like, we can save the environment, we can save the earth through individual action. And also you are someone's savior, whether that's the earth, whether it's other people. And so this, like, these narratives were growing up very dominant in like whenever we did learn about climate change, which wasn't a lot, but it was the dominant story. And I think like having grown up in Germany, I was always a very political and critical thinker. I had a lot of like my family and the community that I was raised in was very was always telling me, you can't be neutral in times of oppression. And recent history from Germany shows that very, very clearly, and continues to tell that story in the times that we still face. And so I think for me, it was kind of like putting these things together and having people, also teach me when I did get into all of these individual lifestyle changes, and then, confronting me of like, hey, but you can't save the earth, and then having to deconstruct that. Okay, like, what does that mean? And why are these narratives that actually like I have been told all of my life growing up, how have they shaped me, and how how are they actually really harmful to the wider community and also to myself, and how can I learn from other communities, from non-human kin. And so I got really involved in like political organizing, like formal politics and informal politics, some people might say, and did a lot of like lobbying, especially during university, in our council in Scotland, where I lived the last 5 years. And also in the university, I was very frustrated with my course at that time because it was very neglecting complexity, and it was very much like, here's the climate science, and or here is a poor neighborhood and here's a rich neighborhood, but the question of like, but why? It's not an inherently poor or inherently rich community. Like, it is a political choice to have poverty, and it is a political choice not to act on the climate crisis. And so I was really frustrated, and thankfully I found my master's where these answers were, where these questions were posed, and it led me to grassroots organizing, and also using my academic outlet, to be an activist scholar, and to choose that, like, that also academia is often a field which upholds, climate injustices, and further produces them or extract knowledge which shouldn't be extracted, and all of these things. So organizing in the political sense and in my academic sense. I hope that made sense.
Made a lot of sense. And I have a maybe too tricky of a question for you, but you've been engaged in 3 different countries. I mean, we haven't even talked about the time that you spent in the United States, but Germany and Scotland, and now you're in Spain. Are there any differences in terms of what you've encountered culturally, or just in terms of circumstances between them, or do you finding common patterns in terms of how the public and policymakers are dealing with these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, like, living in the US in my teens was a big turning point for, the growth, for example, the growth economy is obviously super prevalent also in Europe. Europe has some of the longest history of industrialization, but at the same time, like, I didn't have that experience growing up where I saw how society was so constructed for consumerism, and living there and being really confronted with a different way of living as a teenager suddenly made me realize, like, but where does all of this stuff come from, which I didn't really have like before. Like, it was, I guess maybe that is a turning point if we want to choose one, where and then having to trace back, okay, like, suddenly where are these things? And when I was in the US, I didn't go so much to there wasn't so much grassroots organizing that I did there, but I know a lot of people there, and I always have a bit of FOMO looking at the demonstrations there. But the political situation there is obviously super, super different to the political situations, for example, in the UK, where I was the last 5 years, because we, even the conversations around like stealing land is very different in the UK, because the UK did that abroad. And so the conversation actually is only now starting in the UK, because we are not confronted with like this, like, stealing of land in our own land, although Scotland and England do have that history, but also Scotland was very much profiting of colonialism. So the conversations are a little bit different, and certainly there's also changes right now in the political atmosphere after Brexit, where police violence against activists is becoming stronger and stronger from the governments. And so the framing in the governments are quite interesting, also from a Germany perspective, where European countries love to say they're the leaders, whilst greenwashing that whole agenda. And you can see it in Germany. Germany is one of the best countries to do this. And Scotland as well, and the UK as well, and the US, I think sometimes it's a little bit maybe more, well, with your last presidents, maybe just a bit more ballsy to just say we don't care. So
yeah, I guess you can give us credit for our honesty in some ways, I suppose. Thanks for that. Leslie, I want to turn to you. Maybe you could just briefly share, I don't want to speak for you, but I came to climate awareness, I think, maybe a little bit later in life than than Kevin and Joe. Just curious about your journey to it.
Sure. Well, you're right. I've had about 3 careers at least, depending how I look at my life. But I feel like what I'm doing now with climate psychology is really a blending of what I've learned. So I started out actually in the arts. I have a degree in dance and was a dancer for a number of years. And that way of tuning into the creative wellspring and the role of imagination feels very important in the climate work I'm doing now. And then I became a licensed psychotherapist for a number of years with a primary focus on health psychology, working in a hospital in a really innovative team where the best of science was combined with body workers and meditation and nutrition and inviting the voice of the client into this very collaborative, unusual, interdisciplinary healing approach to crisis and healing. And I would say now it's maybe been almost 15 years ago, for a reason I can't really articulate. There wasn't a particular turning point, but like, much of what has been shared, kind of a cumulative effect of things happening in the environment and the political arena and research. My eyes somehow, thankfully, opened to the severity and the enormity and the urgency of climate change and all of its features, and in a way that I felt like they could never close again. And I really began to examine, well, what can I do out of my life experience and my platform to turn my efforts directly toward contributing in whatever way I most effectively could. And I realized, especially the role of imagination and visioning and an interdisciplinary approach to healing, and psychology in particular, had such a tremendous contribution that I was trained in how we work with denial and what motivates behavior change and what do we do with huge emotions and grief, and how do we facilitate conversations that could become contentious and polarized but might actually become bridge building, and how do we understand our perspectives and beliefs that are the lenses through which we view the world that we're talking about needing to dismantle and shift, because they're so tied to the actions we take and the ways that we view people and communities and situations. So that just really launched me in this direction. And honestly, it's still kind of defining where I'm going to be spending my time, because it's gone from bringing the mental health community on board with climate psychology trainings to working with organizations, to bringing it into my own therapy practice. It's kind of across the board of wherever I can bring this to an interdisciplinary table, to add it in that way where everyone's voice really matters, that I want to add what I can about these perspectives.
Thanks, Leslie. And I think part of the reason we really wanted to have your expertise or your perspective in the room is really surfacing that emotional component to it, and we see that a lot in all age groups. But I imagine it's very, very strong, particularly in younger generations, who know that they're, on some level, know that they're being left, a future that's going to be very different. So thanks, Kevin. I want to turn it back to you now, and really would just love to give you some space to share any insight and perspective and resources or advice you have for young people who may be listening in, who either have not been engaged yet in any form of sort of climate activism or other forms of activism, or who are looking for new ways to get engaged. And if you have personal advice for them, or if you have specific resources, organizations, things to share, you could take it sort of any direction that you want to take it.
Yeah, of course. I'll just say that, the climate crisis and the climate movement is not only a young people movement. This is an intergenerational movement. We need both old and young people involved in this movement, as well as this movement being intersectional, right? We can't just focus on climate justice or the climate crisis as a broader issue, because it's not just a warming of the planet that we have to worry about. There's a multitude of issues that we have to worry about. So I'll just say that. But with that being said, I think with the resources and organizations that I can mention, again, there are quite a lot of them out there, like Sunrise Movement, like my organization, OneUpAction, Re-Earth Initiative from a youth activist that I look up to. Just so many multitudes of issues, 0 Hour, just so many organizations I can name doing amazing work in different sectors of the climate crisis. But I will say that one thing that I will add is that for those who are barely getting involved or wanting to get involved, we need you in this movement, no matter what you can contribute to the movement, whether you're from, whether you know a little bit about the climate crisis or you know nothing at all. I think everyone needs to get involved with this movement, given the critical, stage that we're in and situation that we're in, and given how many years we have left to really reverse the effects of climate crisis. So we need, people who are photographers or videographers, we need lawyers, we need doctors, we need anyone and everyone to just get involved. And so that's what I would say. I wouldn't be able to provide specific resources, but check out the different organizations, local organizations, grassroots organizations that are in your community, and see what they're doing on climate, and see what you could add on. And I think that's one way to get involved, but you can also, as an individual, do whatever you can to change the daily habits, right? Or planting a tree or calling your local representative. Those are just some things that people who don't have as much time can do to really make a difference within their community. Because again, I always have this motto of saying one action does make a difference. And if we were to add up that one action and everyone were to do one action, we can really make a difference. But yeah, that's what I would add.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, it feels like you've been taken on a journey, right? In your, if you want to call it a career around activism, climate activism. I imagine you didn't anticipate where you'd be now when you started. So I'm just curious about, and I also imagine you probably pulled in a lot of directions, right? I mean, you were doing a lot of work that sounds like was quite locally based. You also ended up doing, really engaging with local government, which must have been quite an experience. And now you're dealing with things, I'm sure you're networked and connected with national and international things. So I'm just curious about maybe a little bit of the journey, how you went about sort of saying, well, I'm gonna pursue this opportunity or not, and did you have to develop different skills to engage with sort of different populations of people? Because I imagine trying to deal with the LA County must have been very different than trying to organize kids at your middle school, for example.
Yeah, I guess, it's a different sector because I've worked with both, activists on the ground, as well as local governments, and as well as corporations and foundations and the nonprofit world. So it's just different sectors, and definitely learning the different skills of like, how does this world work, and how can we intersect the civil society part of it and the activism part of it into these different sectors, and really bring in the voices that are needed, those who are affected by this crisis, by these issues, to really make a difference within these different areas, because that was never done before. And I would say for like interacting with LA County being one of the most powerful local governments in our nation, right, in the United States, it was quite difficult. I think I alone was not able to do it. I had to bring on a close friend of mine to really get the motion passed. It was an idea that I had, but I wasn't able to do it alone. You always need someone to help you pursue that idea. And both me and her got to present this idea of a youth climate commission. And miraculously, 3 weeks later, it got passed, which was that's the easy route, right? But a lot of the big policy and a lot of the big motions and the things that we're really wanting to get past, it's not that easy. Really having a game plan of like, okay, what are we trying to really do? What's the impact that this is going to have on the community? What voices are being already affected by this issue, and how can we bring in those voices to make sure that they're heard? There's a lot of like, it might be one person or two people that get it started, but it gets into like making sure that you're communicating with all the stakeholders within said communities and said government levels. But it was, for me, it was quite interesting on the communication part of things, because it was something that I was very uncomfortable with doing, but I knew that it was the right thing to do, because young people were continue to be still around our nation and across the globe, be left out of the decision-making tables and, having a voice within government. So I wanted to change that here, at least in Los Angeles County.
You said something I think is really important, which is not to do it alone, right? And is it fair to say that having a co-conspirator of sorts was really important and useful to you? Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, no, it definitely is a fair comment. No one, at least I haven't seen anyone. There's always someone behind someone, right? And someone helping advance the actions and the change and difference that you're making within a community. So having a co-conspirator to help me along the way and really pursuing what I wanted to pursue was really helpful in getting things, going and making a difference in my community. I didn't touch on the national or international scopes of things, because I'm still getting into that, but done quite a lot with international and national communities. But in the scopes of getting what we passed here in Youth Climate Commission in the national scope and international scope, so that other young people can also have a voice, or just people in general could have a voice within their government.
Yeah, I'm curious. Of course, life is a journey here, but how do you deal with getting pulled in lots of potential different directions? And I don't think it's just necessarily a matter of saying, oh, well, you've built an organization, you have more of a presence now, there are people asking you for things, your organization is growing. Not everyone listening is going to end up in quite a situation like that, but I think it is there. I think a lot of people struggle with this question of like, where do I intervene, right? I mean, on the one hand, I completely agree with you that any action is meaningful. On the other hand, I think people want to feel like they're being strategic. And now you're in a situation where I think, your choices of where you're putting your time feel probably pretty significant. So how have you sort of thought about that? Did you have like a strategy in your head? You're like, I'm going to say no to these things because this is what I'm focused on, or are you being more opportunistic, or kind of what's been the approach that you've taken?
Yeah, I guess, I think I'm always lucky and honored to be in the presence of like getting these opportunities, as well as just making sure that I'm not only being a voice for my community, but being a voice for those who, those who are, left out of the conversation, and I'm wanting to offer a voice to, and make sure that once I have that voice, they also get the same opportunities that I do, right? Because no one is voiceless, they just need to use their voice. But and the question is like, I think any opportunity that comes to me, I'm very strategic in the way that I pursue it, given that I am quite pulled in a lot of directions. I'm sure Josephine and Leslie have the same insights of like being pulled in so many different directions. And I think a lot of people that are advocating for climate justice are always like, oh, what is your stance on, this one thing? And you might not know about it. So I think what my strategy is like whatever I'm best suited for and whatever I can talk about, I kind of lean towards that. And if I'm not best suited for that, I don't kind of go for it. Given that I think there's so many other different people who are amazing in those topics that can go ahead and pursue that and make different changes within that. And I can help support that by amplifying the work that they're doing and even donating, right? Sometimes taking a step back, how do I best intervene? If you have the money, if you can, go ahead and donate to these people. There's so many people that are doing amazing work that can be supported in this journey.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful. So Joe, I guess I want to turn it to you now, and sort of on the same vein, just and you can respond to things that Kevin has said, or just share your perspective. And I know that you're in a different part of the world with different cultural and political realities. So we should probably keep that in mind. But just curious, what kind of advice you might have for people that are either trying to figure out where to engage for the first time, or trying to think about new opportunities. What advice you might have for them? Any resources you might suggest for them?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I guess similar, like on a similar vein, community action and being based in community is, to me, the most single important thing that we can all do, especially when we're starting out, because it's actually like there will be some sort of connection you have. There will hopefully be people that you trust and that you can, that can invite you, and that you can maybe feel at least like a little bit already comfortable, because a lot of people do feel uncomfortable getting into activist spaces. And for us as activists, that's definitely something that we need to be taking seriously, and we need to, decrease and dismantle the barriers that people face in getting into activism. Like, there can't be gatekeeping to our spaces that actually want to dismantle gatekeeping, or or any of the structures that actually produce gatekeeping in the first place. So I think that's something we think about a lot, in the podcast that I do, for example, where we aim to like give tools for people who are just starting out. And that can be something as simple as, like, even if you actually have, for example, not the tools to go to a meeting, like maybe there's another space where you feel more comfortable, and and starting a conversation there around, like, what is climate change, and like how does it actually affect, for example, our local community, and then, but obviously it's not just about that, like it is about the local and the global scales, especially being in Europe, where we don't face the same climate realities that other people do in other places. And climate disparities are also very different within our own country here. So, thinking about all of these different things, and I think something that would strengthen our movement as well is if we link it up with other struggles. Like there's resistance throughout centuries where we can learn from them. And especially like as a younger person, like I look up and I need to learn from the people who come before me, and I want to continue their legacy. I don't want to be the person who stops who kind of like stops their dreams, and stops the justice that they should have gotten. And actually I want to plant the seeds, for the justice that people should receive now and that they should receive in the future. And so I think there's something also to look at, like the history, and look, like for climate justice movements, like why don't we learn from the Black Panthers, for example, who already looked at, school, like free school meals and mutual aid in our communities, and like what does it mean to care for each other. And I think the climate crisis is so much about care. And I think when we especially think, right now my work around like economic growth and looking at more like the structures that are in our society that really look at production and consumption, and like the capitalist world that it's not just these abstract things, like it affects us as well. Like it affects our imaginaries, it affects how I see my worth. Like we are embedded in these things, and where now I define my worth by the work that I produce, even though we all like obviously have worth in ourselves. And like, and dismantling these things, I can't do it by myself, and I shouldn't be someone's savior. I shouldn't actually have the responsibility or the duty placed upon me as an individual to do it either. And I think for me that was such a great unlearning when I went from this like individual to the community perspective, where I was like, but actually, like, I don't have to shoulder it all by myself. And it was a great relief and also a great learning experience, because suddenly I was thinking, you know, like, wow, I know nothing and I have everything to learn from the other people, like from other people. And it gives you so many new perspectives that, as Kevin was saying, like there's a role, you know, everybody has a role and no one has to be perfect. And it's like, for me, I've used skills that I had before joining movements, and I've learned so many new skills. And actually, I think that's the beauty of organizing. Of course, there's so much rage and anger and all of these things, but at the same time, also like the learning and the compassion and the care that you also receive, and that you're allowed to be like, that you are able to share with others, is actually so incredible, you know? So yeah, I would say get involved in grassroots organizing.
Thanks. Yeah, the community piece, and even what Kevin was talking about earlier, with being in community with even just one other person, is, I think, make a profound difference. You mentioned something earlier, Joe, about academic activism, or activist being an activist academic. What does that mean? And I'm curious if maybe just branching out, thinking about the kinds of action people can take to being beyond sort of being, I think sometimes when people think activists, they think somebody's protesting, or, so maybe you could just talk a little bit about the different ways you imagine people being an activist, and what that means for you as an academic now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's, you know, I often don't refer to myself actually as an activist, because it seems like this exclusive club that you can only join when you do a certain action. But, you know, actually for me, it is this like being proactive and wanting to improve things and wanting to change things and being dedicated to, you know, change. And I think we should do that actually in all spaces. Sometimes, you know, it's almost more like wherever we are based, we have impact, right? And actually sometimes it's almost better if we use the platforms that we have to talk about things, to want to change things, rather than doing it in a protest where, you know, for me, for example, as a white able-bodied woman in the UK or now in Spain, I actually have a lot of privilege, and to go to a protest where it's very safe actually for me to attend. And so whilst that is obviously still an exciting and, you know, sometimes also scary moment, of course, at the same time, like sometimes talking to your family and talking to members closer to your own proximity that disagree can be a bit more scary also at the workplace, right? So like, this is, I think, also the activism that we need and that I encourage everyone to do. But finding like-minded people is sometimes what keeps us going in those moments. So that's why I also say grassroots organizing. Activist scholarship for me is using my outlets to also change, you know, to be dedicated also to produce and to work in a way that aims to change things within academia, right? Like, so I use, for example, feminist theory, which doesn't look at the just genders or the gender binary or something. It's a way that I produce knowledge. So, you know, I don't like, it's kind of like a very patriarchal way, for example, of producing knowledge, is saying I'm right and you are wrong. And this is what Western science has done historically and continues to do. But so now there's ways of challenging these like institutional structures that we, you know, we can say, okay, let's open up our ways to new forms of knowledge, how we frame things, how we maybe we work with people who are activists or are excluded from academia, and I use my platform to highlight their voices. There's methods where you can also, for example, do the analysis with them, so that we always have bias, right? But we at least reduce our own bias as much as we can, and we use the outlet that we have. And I think that's something that I'm exploring at the moment. And activist scholar, I mean, it's, to be honest, a fancy word of just saying, you know, I'm dedicated to changing things wherever I am in. But yeah, so I guess like within academia, you know, also the way we teach others and the way that we, you know, like who do we, for example, cite all the time? You know, is it always the same people who have been cited a million times? Or is it, you know, maybe someone who's not looked at all? And Bell Hooks talks about, like, you know, centering the margins, whilst dismantling the structures that build margins, you know. And I think that's what we should do a lot more within academia, because academia has historically also been a tool for assimilation and colonization. And whilst academia exists as it does right now, we need to change it as much as we can.
That is not a small task that you're putting in front of yourself there, but super important.
That's why we need everyone.
Yeah, fair. So Leslie, I want to transition this a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, I think part of the reason we asked you to participate is because I think it's really important to name and discuss the emotional toll, the psychological impacts of grappling with the climate crisis, not to mention all the other issues that we're all contending with. And no matter what areas people are engaging with in terms of their activist work, it's something I think we probably all have in common, not just young people, but I think we're particularly attuned to that reality, I think, for them. So I guess I wanted to start with what you've observed, in your work on emotional resilience to the climate crisis. What are you seeing out there in terms of whether it's clients that are sharing stuff with you, and particularly in terms of what you've heard from young people around this being a concern?
Yes. Well, I'm happy to share what I've seen in my work, what I've seen in my practice, but I also want to share the results of a study that just came out about a month ago that interviewed 10,000 youth across 10 continents. This was about ages, I believe, 16 to 24 or 25. And I'm just going to go over the quick summaries. I'm going to read the international total because it's pretty similar country to country, fluctuates a little bit, but so 83% said people have failed to care for the planet, and that was mostly pointed at government inaction. 75% said the future is frightening. More than half, 56%, said humanity is doomed. More than half, 55%, said they will have less opportunity than their parents or the generations before them. 55% said the things they value most will be destroyed. 52% said their family security will be threatened. And 39% were hesitant to have children of their own. So boy, does that lay out the map, the landscape here of the psychological dimension. And, when it comes to talking about climate emotions, I'm hoping a bit later on we can talk a little bit about tools and what do we do with this. But I want to start by saying that strong feelings in and of themselves are not a problem. In fact, we're built to have these signals because they are saying if you're paying attention, if you're empathetic, if you're caring, of course you're going to be distressed as you learn about climate change. What's more important is what we do with them. And that's where I feel like there's such a big gap, and there's not the material widely available to people. The resources are there, but that's kind of the bridging that I'm wanting to do and wanting to help do, and to get those resources out there. Because there's tremendous amount of information about how to work with our nervous systems, how to channel our feelings in productive ways. But what happens is that we get this information and we just are kind of knocked off our feet and are kind of left swimming in this feeling of overwhelm for many people. And sometimes it's quite pervasive, and sometimes it's in little pockets, and then we kind of find our way back. But the same study said that, again, over half were dealing with these feelings on a daily basis. So it's impacting everything, whether they're in school or their relationships or their health or whatever it is. And, one way I see it, and I think it might be helpful to kind of conceptualize it, is as we awaken to the climate crisis and we find ways to get involved, as has been talked about, it's kind of like this tremendous passion and care and maybe anxiety to jump in and kind of join this race against time. But if we think of it like an athletic event for a minute as a metaphor, sometimes we just start running without training and understanding about pacing and the science of that. We just kind of run till we drop, or we run until we're in pain, or we decide halfway along the way we can't do this anymore. But most anyone who takes it as an endeavor and gets the training in it knows that recovery is part of athletic training. If there are Olympic athletes not meeting their goals, the first thing they look to now is whether or not athletes are doing the part of their training called recovery. It's not conceptualized as stepping away from athletic training. It's built in to training. And that's not just muscular and physiological, it's emotional and mental as well. To be focused on our goals, to push past the goals we had before, to achieve more and to keep stretching. And I think it's helpful to think of it in those terms because there's still a tremendously strong cultural bias, widespread, and it certainly can appear in advocacy work too, that it's a waste of time to focus on emotions. You know, there's so much work to do. Don't get lost in that pit of despair. Because if I make room for my sadness, if I make room for my anger, I'm going to just kind of fall in and not get out. And neuroscience tells us just the opposite is true. That if we push it aside, we push it down, it's like trying to hold a ball underwater that needs to pop up. We're investing a lot of energy and focus in keeping it down. And it comes out sideways in depression, in a lot of ways. Could come out as violence, could come out as drug use, wanting to numb and distance, because there's not a way to deal with it. So that's what I would love to see woven into all the training and efforts that are being made that are beautiful. And just to add this dimensionality, because as has been spoken of in different ways, addressing this world that's different from one we've ever known requires addressing our humanity and our internal landscapes in ways that are different than we've ever known. And we have to reach more deeply into what it means to be human. And that includes the internal work side by side with the external work.
Thank you for that. Kevin and Joe, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I want to give you an opportunity to share whatever you feel comfortable sharing, just about your own process of contending with sort of the emotional enormity of all of this, and maybe what you've observed with colleagues and friends, of any age. Leave it to either of you to go.
Yeah, I can go. I guess, doing this work, for at a very young age and now being a decade since doing it, I think I was in that constant motion of like, if I don't, if I suppress my feelings and leave them in and continue with the climate anxiety or just anxiety of like, okay, it's now or never, we have to act, forget about my feelings, forget about the anxiety. And I think that's with a lot of young people that I've spoken to. It's like, that is basically the same thing that they've been going through for such a long time, no matter how many years that they've been involved in, right? A lot of us are just in the mentality of that we need to get things done, we need to start acting. But recently, I came to notice that, if I don't take that rest, if I don't let my body, regain its energy to continue the work that I'm doing, there won't be justice for our community. So I think the mentality of like rest is resistance, joy is resistance, or joy is needed and rest is needed, right? I think that is something that I've integrated within my activism that whenever I get burnt out or I'm feeling really just like, I'm being pulled left or right, um, I can take that and really kind of just, put everything off and say, you know what, I can come back to it. I can come back to this a later time. I'm going to take this time for myself and my body and really just regain the energy that I've lost to come back to the work that I enjoy so much. And I think that's with a lot of young people I've seen that I've been speaking to who suffer from climate anxiety, who for so long were just suppressing their feelings and, allowing burnout and, anxiety and a lot of these feelings to be suppressed. But, a lot of the young people that I speak to now are really taking a broader look at what, that we would never get justice if we're not well rested. And so I think that is a good part of it, but it's also like there are some of those, not even young people, there's just again, it's an intergenerational thing. It's like where people are facing climate anxiety and like what are ways that are they adapting to taking time for themselves and understanding that they can come back to this work. I recently started doing TM, which is like a meditation thing, which I never in 100, years that I've been doing this work thought I was going to get into, but I'm, now doing it, and it's helping me kind of get my energy back and really focus on myself. And I do that with a bunch of other climate activists. So it's not just me that's doing it. It's a group of climate activists that's come together to do meditation, which is it's building that community of like, okay, we need rest. We need to take that time for ourselves. And if we don't, we're not able to achieve what we're wanting to achieve. So that's all I have to say about that. And I'll pass it to Joe.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, because I was going to say I hope for more community care spaces. Like, as much as I advocate for, taking time for ourselves and, everyone deserves rest regardless, like I hope for our movements to, do more resilience building and do more community care and to strengthen that, like, because essentially, like, even dealing with all of those feelings by yourself is so overwhelming. And in the UK, there's a group starting resilience building around climate anxiety, which is really wonderful. And I think for me, when I was in those years of like doing very much like individual action, I think that's when my feelings around this were the highest and the worst. And I mean, my heart still breaks every day looking at the state of the world. But I think I've come to a point now where I have a toolkit where actually I can deal with that. And I also know that placing them into action and placing them also in the wider scale, right? Because there's something different about anticipating climate breakdown and experiencing climate breakdown. And my reality is still very sheltered and actually really, really good in terms of climate chaos. And having, of course, and this is not to diminish like my own feelings or other people's feelings, who don't experience any of that, because actually I think, especially like the society that I grew up in, grief is not an active part of our life, especially not grieving for non-human kin and the land. And I think these are really strong emotions that I'm so grateful to be able to like foster and train also, and reconnecting with that. But at the same time, for me, placing it in the wider scale of, like my feelings are not the center of this movement, and that's okay, and that's actually quite good. And I need community to deal with my feelings and to like use these feelings for actions. But yeah, I think when I didn't have that, it was very scary, and so I wish everybody like has more community around them to do these things.
Thanks both. Leslie, I want to turn back to you. We don't have a lot of time, but you mentioned some resources or some more practical things that maybe people could consider. So I just want to give you the floor to maybe talk a little bit about what recommendations or things you might offer in terms of guidance for folks listening who are to deal with their own emotions around the climate crisis.
Yes, I love what's been shared so far about in the same way that climate action isn't an individual act, neither is dealing with these the emotional landscape, and that to do it in community is really wonderful and essential. And some of it does have to do with getting acquainted with our own edges, our own nervous system. There's a concept that comes out of trauma studies called our zone of resilience, or our window of tolerance. And it has to do with, when we get past a certain point of however much is coming at us, or however intense our life may be, if we hit this edge of overwhelm, we either lash out in anger, and literally part of our brain goes offline. We cannot reason. We cannot have a reasonable conversation at that point. Because it's common sense if you think about a heated conversation where you need kind of a cooling off period, and you come back and then it's often more productive. Or we drop out and we disassociate, and we just kind of close our ears and we close our minds because we need that break. And so if we don't do it intentionally, we do it unconsciously and automatically, which is so much less productive. So that ability to get familiar with where those edges are, and then the interventions can be very broad. I was talking to a 14-year-old girl the other day about this, and she was saying what she chooses to do in those moments when she needs a break is skateboard. And I heard her talking about how she has to be in her body, and she's in the moment, and she's tuned into her environment, because all that's required in that activity. And it's not to say that obviously that's the answer for everyone, but I love adding that because it might be meditation, like Kevin was saying, it might be skateboarding, might be talking to friends and colleagues and others doing similar work. It might be kickboxing or art. So it's such a huge step simply to say, I recognize the importance of this, and I'm going to look at myself and look at the things that are helpful to me in particular, and to create kind of a wellness plan. And again, to be attentive to kind of that subtle shift between being on edge or kind of buzzing internally, or whatever it kind of looks like for you, and recognizing that qualitative difference compared to being more grounded, more with yourself, having, again, more of you online, more of you present, more of you capable of engaging.
Thank you. And we did send out some materials to folks who registered. Is there anything you want to say about those, or a suggestion you have about how people use them?
Yeah, so some of the concepts I've been talking about, I put out, as well as a guidebook that I created with a couple of other therapists. It's just a free PDF, but it is a whole bunch of emotional resiliency practices that can be used in group settings. Some of them are very adaptable for individual use, but it's the idea that if this is being recognized, but it hasn't quite yet been incorporated, this is one resource for that. Also, the two books I've written, one for the mental health community and one for 8 through 12-year-olds, are chock full of these kinds of practices. Because what I did, especially for the one for the tweens, is it goes back and forth between climate science and emotional resiliency or emotional intelligence, and more information about what's happening, and then noticing what's happening for you, and writing about it, or talking about it, or doing art about it, or making a plan for action. Because it is always about this work in blended with agency and action, and making those needed changes we're all talking about, but really getting them aligned so that we're working, all those parts are working together rather than potentially in conflict with each other. I will say other good resources are through the Climate Psychology Alliance. Has a lot of online resources. There's a US organization and one, I believe, based in the UK. They have climate aware therapist directory if people wanted more individual work. They do climate cafes, which is coming together and talking about experiences with a facilitator, all very available and accessible, low cost.
It sounds like a common theme here is community for all of these things in terms of action, of maybe not feeling quite like the entire fate of the entire planet is on our individual shoulders, and then also maybe finding the support that we need and giving support to others. Seems like community is a common thread there. For me, I guess I think what you're talking about, Leslie, and the resources that you shared are applicable not just for concerns about the climate crisis. Obviously, this is very present, but we've in different ways, all of us here have been dealing with, with the pandemic and other issues that have taken a toll on all of us. I think we've seen in ourselves and others, and unfortunately, it's probably not, not on the horizon that all those concerns are going to go away, right? They're going to become more present and more real. So investing in this now, I think, is really key. And for any folks on the call who support activist organizations, whether they're in philanthropy or do other things, I really do feel like there needs to be a cultural shift within the activist community, and it would be great if that was led actually by philanthropy to put a priority on this, because I have seen people really burning themselves out and feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders. We don't have a lot of time left. I want to give each of you maybe an opportunity to share any reflections you have, if there's anything that we didn't touch upon that you feel like is important to share, any last resources that you want to offer or put out. Just want to give each of you maybe a couple of minutes to do that. Let's see, why don't we start? Well, let's go in reverse. So Leslie, I'm going to start with you first.
Okay, thank you. Well, I guess I will just end on either an invitation or a challenge, whichever works best for you, to take what's been talked about and before the end of the day, make a wellness plan for yourself with what we're talking about. It's always good to get good ideas and inspiration from each other, but it's like they say, the best tools for gardening, if they stay in the tool shed, don't do much good. They've got to get out and be used. And so that's my invitation for everyone, to either design it based on what you know, or start with looking at or for some of these other resources for self-care.
Great, thank you. Joe.
I love that. I definitely need to do that. But I guess actually just following on from that like we can't afford to lose people through burnout, and to not take on the work on climate justice because of either fear of burnout, or because it is too overwhelming. Like, everyone is needed, and I think for people who are already very active, you deserve to be taken care of by yourself and by others. And the more people we do have in these moments, the less burden there are on individuals, and the less burnout we actually will face as the people who are already fighting in this. So I guess also an invitation to, do take rest, and, do join so that people can take rest. And also remembering that, like, we are needed, like we all are needed, and the earth, does love us, and like that we are deserving of, better futures. So yeah, I hope that we can actually practice those better futures in the fight for them.
Thanks. Before I turn to you, Kevin, I just was wondering for you, Joe, you talked about your journey earlier of sort of thinking about the larger questions, if you want to call it intersectionality or the larger systems. Is there anything that you would say, well, read this book, or, and not to put you on the spot, but any particular thing that that comes to mind in terms of a way for people to think more systemically about the issues that we're facing?
I'm not sure there's one book.
Sure.
I think like learning from as many people as possible. I mean, I think there's one book collection that I haven't finished yet, but All We Can Save by two authors from the US. I don't remember the authors. That talks a lot about different things, but also incorporates art and poetry and different pictures. And I mean, I suppose, I'm exploring degrowth at the moment, which for me is quite encouraging because it opens up. It is a mostly at the moment still European-based framework and looks at like degrowing our economies in countries which have extracted a lot and don't need more consumption production, basically, and restructuring society. And I think it opens up plural futures, new imaginations, but this work is also based on other people's work. So I can have a think and maybe I can send over some resources.
Thanks. Sorry to put you on the spot there. Kevin, I'm going to turn to you. Any closing thoughts, resources, other things that we didn't touch on?
Yeah, I just turned off my camera because I actually have an All We Can Save book. Two of my, actually quite a lot of people I admire are in this book. Two youth activists. The only youth activists in this book are close friends of mine, Shea and Alexander Villaseñor, both of which do amazing at, kind of taking us through Indigenous knowledge and just quite a lot of youth activism. So if you haven't already, this is a little bit of my input of like a good resource of All We Can Save. I have so many climate books that I've read, and this one has to be one of my favorites. A piece of advice that I would give, or closing thoughts that I would give, is rest is needed and rest is resistance, and joy is also needed, right? We can't get climate justice if we're not taking that time for ourselves to be in community with not only ourselves, but with the people that we love. And so I would add that. And then for those that are solutionists, those that are taking actions, make sure we can't get climate justice if our solutions aren't intersectional, right? We must have intersectional solutions to solve intersectional issues. And that's something that I've kind of went on and started telling everyone, just given that, we are in a moment of, of awakening, as well as making sure that people and nations and governments are taking approaches to the climate crisis that are intersectional as well as intergenerational. So yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm going to leave it there. We're going to end a couple of minutes early, just because I think that's a really you hit strong points there, Kevin. And I'd like to encourage everyone who took the time to join us. First of all, thank you for doing that, and take care of yourselves. Find the path that's yours. And get connected to community. There is a community of people out there. It's the one thing that I think gives me the most hope. So I really want to thank you, Leslie and Joe and Kevin, for all that you do, for taking the time to join us, and be well. Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.